Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. We're so excited to have you all joining us today for our webinar on gender data, why and how to use gender data statistics to propel your advocacy efforts. I'm Susan Papp. I'll be serving as your moderator today. I'm the Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy here at Women Deliver. And we are so thrilled to have such a wonderful turnout of participants on this call. We're at capacity. And I think the interest in this webinar clearly shows how much of an emphasis the advocacy community is starting to turn toward data-driven advocacy. And it illustrates just how essential sound evidence is to fueling meaningful policy change that promotes gender equality. Today, you'll hear from a number of speakers, and they'll be providing presentations, and we'll be discussing their perspectives and case studies in the next hour. And we hope that it will be an opportunity for you to deepen your knowledge and skills around effectively leveraging data and data tools to advance gender equality advocacy. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by experts and perspectives from 3 different organizations. They're dialing in from London, and Paris and Washington, D.C., and here at Women Deliver, we're in New York. First, I'd like to introduce Nina Rabinovich Blecker. She's the Director of Communications at Data2X, based at the UN Foundation. Then we have Gael Ferrand. She's an economist and the Gender Program Coordinator for the OECD, and recently helped launch the new SIGI report that you'll hear about later today. And then we have Allison Holder, the Director of Equal Measures 2030, and she's joined also by her colleague Albert Motivens, the Head of Data and Insights at Equal Measures 2030. Just a bit of housekeeping points. At the end of the call, there will be, at the end of the webinar rather, there will be time for questions and answers. So please feel free to write your questions and answers in the chat box as the presenters are making their presentations, and we'll make sure to address as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. We are also recording this webinar, so we will make a link available to you to access it in the coming days. And if you'd like to share it with your colleagues, please feel free to do so. And we also would encourage you to take a short survey at the end of the webinar. It's going to be about a 2-minute survey, and it'll really help us figure out how we can provide resources and tools to enhance skills and knowledge around advocacy in the future. So we would be very, very grateful if you could fill out that survey. So with all of the housekeeping items out of the way, let's begin with some background on what is gender data. The World Bank identifies and refers to gender data as sex disaggregated data and gender statistics covering demography, education, health, and access to economic opportunities, public life and decision-making, and agency. Gender data includes information on gender issues, and this is how the World Bank defines these issues. Issues that affect women, issues related to gender inequalities, and differences in the roles between men and women. Today, we'll be zeroing in on data issues that are relevant to girls and women, such as maternal mortality, informal work, education, and other social determinants of health, well-being, and empowerment. Achieving progress on gender equality for girls and women really depends that we leverage and harness the power of accessible gender data. Data is important to shining a light on the lived realities of girls and women. Gender data informs evidence-based policymaking and decision-making and is a critical tool for accountability purposes so that civil society and constituents can hold their governments accountable to the promises they make and ensure that policies truly leave no one behind. However, collecting and identifying and using gender data pertaining to girls and women can be very difficult. In general, there can be limited information on sex disaggregated data and issues related to property ownership, climate change impacts, women's economic empowerment, among other issues. And Nina will be illustrating what those issues are in her talk later this morning. There are a number of reasons for the lack of sex disaggregated data. And some of these reasons include the lack of prioritization by governments and society, insufficient financial resources, biases in data collection and reporting, and unsafe spaces for girls and women to report their experiences. When sex disaggregated data are lacking or don't exist, we refer to these as gender data gaps. And when there are gender data gaps, it means that the experiences and needs of girls are hidden and not adequately reflected and represented in our programs and our policies. In these cases where gender data gaps exist and data aren't always available or used by governments, it's women and girls who suffer. And in order to truly drive meaningful programming and advocacy influencing work, we need to fill these gender data gaps. Again, these data gaps stem from a lack of information on data that's available. Advocates also have a hard time interpreting the data that do exist, and the biases diminish the importance of focusing on sex disaggregated data. So today we'll talk a little bit about knowing where and how to find sex disaggregated statistics and how to push for their greater collection and widespread use, and just how critical it is to informing policies and programs that are truly inclusive and responsive. And what does inclusive and responsive mean? It means that health policies cover services that best support girls' and women's health needs, which are often different and unique from the health needs of boys and men. It means that efforts to propel political participation of girls and women we have an opportunity to unpack the demographics of those who vote and those who stay home and those who have access to the polls. It means monitoring and evaluating efforts to assess whether services like education and transportation are reaching and serving girls and women that they're designed for, and that they're safe and their needs are not overlooked. Armed with data and evidence, advocates can call attention to policies and programs that are not delivering for girls and women. We can use data to push national authorities and development actors to make informed and inclusive decisions when we use a gender lens to assess progress and implementation to make sure programs are not leaving anyone behind. At Women Deliver, we know that advocating for gender equality and the health and rights of girls and women is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Gender data and statistics help this advocacy to be stronger, informed, and more effective. And today we're going to learn more about these tools and techniques and resources from the distinguished group of speakers. With that, I'm delighted to turn it over to Nina from Data2X, who will delve into some data terms. She'll also highlight important data gaps that exist, and she'll highlight ways that we can advocate to fill those data gaps. Over to you, Nina.
Hi, thank you so much, and sorry for that short pause, just getting some of the technical details worked out. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you so much for that introduction, Susan, and thank you especially to Women Deliver for inviting me to participate in this very exciting conversation. You can imagine that it made my gender data heart sing to learn that this webinar was fully subscribed. So you can go to the next slide, please. So I just want to start very briefly with an introduction to Data2X for those of you who don't know us. As Susan said, we are the Gender Data Alliance that's housed at the United Nations Foundation. We firmly believe that we can't achieve gender equality and improve the lives of all people around the world without quality, unbiased, and complete gender data. Our mission is twofold. We seek to build the case and mobilize action for gender data, and we seek to strengthen the production and use of gender data. And we do all of this through partnerships. We work with the United Nations and other multilateral agencies, with governments, civil society organizations, and with the private sector. Much of our work stems from identifying where the gaps are in the gender data and then devising creative solutions through partnerships to begin filling these gaps. But before I dive into the specifics of our work around gender data gaps and the connection to advocacy, I want to just quickly lay out a few things that I believe are really key to successfully advocating using gender statistics. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So the very first thing is I think a critical distinction just needs to be made, that there's a big difference between advocating with data and advocating for data. Advocating with data means using data to bolster your argument. So for example, if data shows that in a particular area, a much smaller percentage of girls attend school than boys, that data can be used to support calls to address barriers that girls might be facing, preventing them from attending school. On the other hand, advocating for data is different. Here, we're not just using the data to support a call for change in a policy or a program. Here, the argument itself is a call for the increased collection, production, analysis, and use of data. So this is the type of advocacy. This type of advocacy can be based on gender data gaps, and that's what I'll be discussing in a moment. Next slide, please. So if you're advocating for filling gender data gaps, chances are you're going to be targeting a relatively technical audience. It might be decision makers and governments who you want to use gender data to make policy decisions. Maybe it's statisticians who you want to prioritize the collection of gender statistics. In any case, it's really important to be able to speak to your audience. And I've laid out just a few quick things here to think about before embarking on this type of advocacy. I'm not going to go into great detail, but obviously I'm happy to continue this conversation offline after the webinar. So some very just quick key points. First of all, to make sure that you're clear about your terminology. There's a difference between data and statistics. And also it's very sort of important to mention that in the data space, the data community often talks about sex disaggregated data, as Susan mentioned in the definition from the World Bank earlier. In the gender space, we often talk about gender disaggregated data. This is a small distinction, but an important distinction to note when you're talking to a technical audience. Also important to note that different sources of data can provide varying levels of detail and can help us catch different people's experiences. So for example, with improved collection of administrative data, we can ensure that girls and women are counted through better birth and marriage registration systems, while increasing survey data can help us know how many people might be working in the informal economy. Again, just important to know about the different types of data collection methods and what we're advocating for based on the problems we're trying to solve. And finally, there's no doubt that we need better data, not just about women, but about all population groups. But to get data that's not just about women, but about girls, or girls living in rural areas, or girls in rural areas with disabilities, means that we're going to require multiple disaggregations of the data, which then has implications for data collection methodologies and for sample size, et cetera. So all of this to say is that I'm not saying that we shouldn't be advocating for all of these things, but simply that it's really key that we understand the implications behind what we're calling for. One of the roles that Data 2X plays is that of sort of translator between communities that speak different languages, like the data community and the gender community. And we try to create very clear materials. So I encourage you to check out the Resource Center on our website. And we're also in the midst of a redesign right now and are building a glossary page for our new website, which will hopefully help make some of these technical terms more accessible to those who want to be able to communicate with a more technical audience. So please, after the webinar, check all of this out. And if you notice something that's missing that your organization would find useful, please reach out. We're constantly developing new materials, and we want to ensure that we're meeting the community's needs. So next slide, please. So with all that out of the way, I want to turn to what I was actually asked to speak about, which is using gaps in gender data to drive advocacy efforts. I think sometimes talk of data can feel divorced from the real lives of real people, but the importance of complete data can't be overstated. When there are gaps in our data, it means that we don't have information about key aspects of people's lives. And it can mean that decisions and policies are being made without full understanding of lived realities. So I believe that any advocacy effort needs to begin by humanizing the data, which is exactly what we tried to do as part of a mini International Women's Day campaign, which you see here. Next slide, please. This campaign was used to promote a report that Data 2X just released a few weeks ago. We released this during the UN Statistical Commission, coinciding with International Women's Day. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we examined in this report called Bridging the Gap, and talk about how this work can be used to inform advocacy efforts around filling gender data gaps. Next slide, please. So really fast, some very quick background information about what the report looked at, what this research looked at. And again, you can find more information on our website, and I believe Women Deliver is going to be sending out the link to the report following the webinar. But this report took a deep dive into looking at gender data availability in 15 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We looked at what was the status of gender data gaps in these countries and what are the most effective ways to close these gender data gaps. We looked at data for 104 different gender-related indicators. You can see on the screen in the chart all the way to the right where these indicators were pulled from. We were looking at international data sources, national data sources, microdata sources. We were looking for different types of data gaps for availability, timeliness, disaggregation, and adherence to standards. And we looked at the data across 6 different, we called them domains, areas of life. So we looked at data around health, education, economic opportunities, human security, environment, and political participation. So now what I'm going to do is just very quickly share some of the key findings that came out of the report and show how this research could help inform advocacy with some illustrative calls to action. But these are just examples, and there's really much more that can be done with this work. Next slide. So one key finding was that we lack gender data for almost half of all gender-related indicators. This was true in both national and international data sources. We found that for some of the gender-related indicators, there was data, but the data wasn't sex disaggregated. So we couldn't actually find specifics about women's lives versus men's lives. Some were lacking data altogether. Here, the call to action is obvious. There's clearly some very basic work that's needed to be done to produce nearly half of the gender indicators. So we need to prioritize the closing of the gender data gap by collecting this data at both national and international levels. Next slide. Here you can see the different domains or sectors that we looked at in this research. On the left, it shows the different areas and the number of indicators there were for each area. And on the right, it's a slightly complicated graph, but basically the black line and the number in black represent the total number of gender-related indicators. The orange line represents what exists at the national level across the 15 countries we looked at. The blue line is what exists at the international level. I'm not going to dig into the details, but the main takeaway from the research is that even for the sectors where we do have relatively good gender data, like health, there still are gaps. And there's some sectors, like environment, where there's a paucity of gender data overall. So this can really help inform sector-specific calls to action, which is really important. I think advocacy will be more successful for not just sort of advocating for closing gender data gaps writ large, but depending on your area of focus and where you particularly work, you can hone in on where the data needs are and develop calls to action to fill sector-specific gaps. Next slide, please. Here, what we see is when the data was collected and when the indicators were produced for each of the gender-related indicators. And though there was a bit of a blip there in 2016 where more data was collected, the majority of data that we saw, over 2/3, was collected over 4 years ago. This means that the data is either being collected infrequently or that there's delays in processing the data. But in either case, it means that governments don't have up-to-date information, so they can't understand the needs and realities of their population. And then they can't use this data to effectively make decisions, make policies. So to address this, again, call to action, there needs to be more frequent data collection. We need a more balanced data cycle. We need to call for strengthening statistical capacity in individual countries so that this data collection can happen more regularly. Next slide. And this is the last point I'm going to pull out of this research, which is that because of limited capacity, countries are forced to make a choice between how much data to collect and how frequently to collect it. So these maps make this trade-off clear. Some countries have prioritized producing a large number of gender indicators, but doing it less frequently. Others have prioritized producing fewer indicators, but collecting data for those indicators more frequently. In either case, there's a trade-off that people are making, and advocates can use this trade-off to call for better resourcing for gender data in countries and for statistical systems and for governments to prioritize gender data collection frequently and frequently, regularly producing the data they need. Final slide, please. So this was just a really quick introduction to how gender data gaps can be used to inform advocacy. In the next stage of our work, Data2X is going to be preparing some country assessments for the countries we studied and policymaker briefs. So hopefully these products will also be useful for you in your advocacy efforts. So stay tuned. Those will be coming later this summer. But again, I'm happy to discuss anything that I just presented on in more detail. So please check out the report online and definitely be in touch with questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. It was wonderful to hear about the Bridging the Gap report that came out earlier this month. And we really appreciated the 4 calls to action. And know a number of the participants calling in are advocates. And if an advocate loves anything, it's a strong call to action. So thank you for distilling so much of that report into very pithy calls to action. Now we'll hear from Gael, who's going to walk us through the Social Institutions and Gender Index, what is commonly referred to as the SIGI report. The SIGI report was recently launched also earlier this month. So we're very keen to hear from Gael about some of the tools and resources and insights that advocates can glean from the new report and the data efforts that you have underway at OECD. Over to you, Gael.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I hope that everybody can hear me well. So let me first of all thank Women Deliver. Yes, we can. So perfect. Thank you guys for answering because I feel a bit lonely here in Paris. Anyway, thank you very much, Women Deliver, for organizing this webinar. Thank you also to Data2X and Equal Measure to share their experience and expertise that I think is clearly complementary to ours. And thank you so much for the participants because I think that something is clear to me. We are producing data, we are collecting data, we are harmonizing data, but we don't want those data or those reports to stay locked in a library. It's really important for us that everybody is using it. And again, I think that this webinar, the topic of today's webinar is critical because data we are producing are not only for statisticians or gender experts with quantitative background to use, but for advocates, for policymakers. And this is clearly our mandate at the OECD Development Center. So very quickly, the Development Center is actually composed by OECD and non-OECD countries, and all focus is on development, gender and development. But as gender inequalities, unfortunately, are a universal issue, we are looking at both OECD and non-OECD countries. And to answer the question asked by Nina, that is, to me, very important, whether we are advocate with data or for data, I will say that I'm doing both. We have been able, with the SIGI data, for example, to show that social norms are critical to achieve gender equality. And I remember when we had this post-2015 discussion at the UN, we really pushed for having much more gender disaggregated data, but also gender-focused data, because, again, we need to move deeper to better understand what are the barriers to really address gender issues. So this is my pleasure today to present you the Social Institution and Gender Index and how you can use it. So in the next slide, you will see what is our main focus. And I really like using this iceberg picture because our contribution or added value is really to look at the invisible part of the gender iceberg. And this is something very important that, again, Nina said, is that without measuring it, it's not visible. So our focus is really to look at the formal and informal laws, the social norms and the practices that restrict or exclude women and girls. Formal laws, why? Because I can tell you that still in our countries, our own countries, all over the world, girls could be married before turning 18 with some parental or judicial consent. So the formal issue is a very big one. But the informal too, because even if sometimes, for example, it's totally forbidden to be married before 18, if customary, traditional, and religious laws are asking for, are calling for this persistent harmful practice, it will continue because you can just be married without being registered. And then when you turn 18, you go to the civil marriage registration institution and you register your marriage. So this is something very important. And if informal laws are still discriminated against women and girls, this is also because of our social expectations. So that's why for us it's very important to look at this. In the next slide, you will see that, again, this is something that is very important. And here I can already show you, in the next slide, please. Yes. Yeah, I can already show you how you can use our data for advocacy purposes. So, again, you have thousands of data, thousands of gender indicators, but ours is doing something different. We are not giving you numbers of girls enrolled in secondary school or women in labor force participation. What we will try to give you are data needed for understanding why, despite increasing investment and interest to gender equality, notably in skills and education, the efficiency of standard policies is not as good as we expect. Maybe because we neglect this deeply entrenched discrimination in social norms and practices. A very simple example here, girls' education in Niger. Despite, again, attracting $1 trillion of investment, we have still 16% of girls aged 15 to 19 that have been married in Niger. And this maybe could explain why 73% of lower secondary school age girls are out of school. And this is not only costly for the girls, but also for the country itself, because child marriage has also a cost. In the next slide, I will show you what kind of data you can use also from our country studies, because we are providing data at the international level, but also collecting data at the national level. And when working in Burkina Faso, something that was very important for the civil society organization, but also for the governments, was to look at female genital mutilation. They spent $1,000 billion in trying to eradicate this harmful practice, but still 2/3 of women have been mutilated. And this is something that is very difficult to understand, is that despite the fact that actually most of the population think that this practice should not continue, it's 80% of the population thinking that it should be abandoned, you still have the practice. And the next slide will maybe tell you why. 50% of men will prefer being married to women who have undergone FGM. So this is the kind of information that is very important for all of us to better understand the vicious cycle, but also to advocate for other action. I mean, for rethinking the way we address gender inequalities. In the next slide, very quickly, I would like to show you what is the SIGI and explain you how you can use it. So actually, the SIGI is a composite index. So a composite index is actually just a big picture. It gives you a number on the level of discrimination on social norms, social practices, informal and informal laws. This is very important for advocacy because you can say, well, look, women are facing various forms of discrimination, but in this country or this country, the total level of discrimination is higher or lower. So this is something that is, I will say, a first step for everybody to take into account to really be aware of the issues. Then you can look at the dimensional level, whether those kind of discrimination are in the family, related to physical integrity, access to resources, or civil liberties. It's very important because from one country to another one, it will differ, and so meaning that the action that you have to take on are also different from one country to another one. And then you have different indicators, different topics. And something that is very important to me is that within a topic, you have also different areas. So let's look very quickly at violence against women. When I'm saying that violence against women is a topic, this is because we are able to provide you information on the level of discrimination in the laws, but also the social acceptance and the prevalence. So for each of the 16 topics you can see on this slide, you always have this different level of information. And this is something that is very important to you because, of course, it will give you more arguments and more information on where we have to begin. So very quickly, the next slide is telling you that we are providing data at the global level, but also analysis at the regional and national level, depending on your needs. And we are a data source for SIGI 5.1.1 on legal frameworks. The next slide presents you the 4 tools of the SIGI, so what you can use. So, sorry, for the next slide, please. So in this slide, you have the database, all the raw numbers you would like to use that are harmonized. And this is something very important. Here, with those data, you can compare countries. This is not always the case when you collect data from by your own. In the next slide, I can tell you that we also have qualitative information through 180 country profile. I'm an economist, I like numbers, but I think that most of the time you need to have this kind of qualitative information to set the scene and better understand the situation. In the next slide, I tell you that, again, once you have these 1,000 data that sometimes give you a headache, you can have something summarized in a ranking. So sorry, it's the next slide, please. The next one. Exactly. So this is the kind of thing that you can use for your advocacy. Discrimination in laws are really very different from one region to another one, and the level of discrimination will tell you a first story is that in some countries women are facing various ways of discrimination. So you have this overlapping and life cycle pressure on women that really restrict their opportunities. And finally, what I can tell you in this slide is that usually when people don't want to take the human right aspect of gender inequality issue, you can maybe tell them that they lose money. And I think that this is a very powerful way to talk to some of our policymakers to make them understanding that gender equality is not only a woman issue, it's an issue for all of us. And finally, the last tool that we can offer with the SIGI is the policy simulator. So with this policy simulator, you can try to make either legal reforms or reduce acceptance of discrimination such as violence against women, or reduce the prevalence of violence against women, and see how it affects your aggregate level of discrimination. So to conclude, what I can say is that having data is very important, first of all, to make visible the invisible. Second, to enable comparison and make analysis. Third, to identify challenges. And finally, to monitor, understand progress, and to make some policies, but also better advocacy for your own country. But the problem is that we definitively need data, and I think that Nina already made the case for investing in more data. So thank you so much. I stay at your disposal for any question, and please feel free to visit our website, genderindex.org.
Thank you very much, Gael, for that helpful summary of all of the many tools that the SIGI provide. I think the policy simulator is a dream to any advocate, and we look forward to encouraging our fellow advocates to spend time there to look at the potential impacts of the advocacy efforts that they have underway. With respect to our next speaker, sets of speakers, I'm really delighted to introduce Alison Holder and Albert Motivans from Equal Measures 2030. Equal Measures 2030 is a partnership that Women Deliver is engaged with, and you'll be hearing about them today, but also in the future at the Women Deliver conference, they'll be launching a new gender equality index in June. Equal Measures 2030 is also a Deliver for Good campaign partner. And Deliver for Good is a campaign that's designed to put a gender lens to the SDGs. And we hope that the work of Equal Measures 2030 and the index and the advocacy that they're doing through that effort can be a huge contribution to not only the Deliver for Good campaign, but also the achievement of the SDGs across the board. So I'll turn it over to Alison and Albert to talk to us a little bit about the work of Equal Measures 2030.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Just if one person can let me know that something's coming through the...
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Great. Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, Susan, and to Nina and Gail as well for great presentations. So I am Alison Holder, and I'm the Director of Equal Measures 2030, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about a specific data product and tool that Equal Measures creates called the SDG Gender Index. But we're also going to talk about the work that we as Equal Measures do more broadly, helping advocates to use data, including the kinds of tools that Data2X and the OECD produce. I'll give a couple of very brief slides just with a bit more background about Equal Measures so that you can see who we are and how we fit in. In one sentence, I describe our role as connecting data and evidence with advocacy and action on gender equality. And we've got a specific focus on ensuring that girls' and women's movements and advocates more broadly and decision makers have easy to use data and evidence to guide efforts to reach the SDGs by 2030. Next slide, please. One of the things we're most known for is the kind of data that we compile and produce, as I mentioned, the SDG Gender Index. But actually, a very big part of our work is directly supporting primarily women-led organizations in, at the moment, 7 countries. Tanzania is our most recent country, so you can see they're not actually colored there. But we have been working for about 18 months or so. We provide funding as well as technical support to grassroots organizations in these countries who want to use data to really fuel their advocacy on whichever issue they're working on. And I'll come back to a couple of examples from the work of our national partners towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. But Equal Measures 2030 as an organization is actually a partnership. So we were formed by, it's now 10 organizations, many of whom you'll recognize, including both Data2X and Women Deliver, who are on the call with us here today. We've got actors from across civil society, the development sectors, and even the private sector. And you may recognize some of the regional women's rights organizations, Aero, Femnet, and CLADM, who are active in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, respectively. So I represent the Secretariat of Equal Measures, as does Albert, but we really are a collective effort of all of these organizations. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Albert, who's going to introduce you to one of our newest tools that's available for advocates to be able to see how their countries are faring on gender equality issues across the SDGs. We see this as hopefully a key accountability and advocacy tool. And then after Albert introduces you to the index, we'll come back to me and I'll say a little bit more about what our partners in the 7 countries I showed you are really doing to use data to really strengthen their advocacy for a whole range of issues affecting women and girls in their country.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alison. So just to start by saying that the index is a bit of a work in progress as well. We're launching the index at the Women Deliver conference in Vancouver at the beginning of June. So I'll talk a little bit about what the index looks like, how you'll be able to use it, but I'll be able to show examples from our pilot study, which was carried out in our 6 focus countries. So basically, the index is a composite indicator, much like SIGI, as Gail described. We're trying to generate an overall country score that captures progress towards gender equality in the SDGs. And it's very much important that it's embedded in the SDGs as an accountability mechanism. This is something that a number of countries have signed up to, the governments have signed up to the commitments in the SDGs, so it provides advocates with leverage in terms of holding them accountable, but also for a number of other reasons as well. That we also allow scoring of individual goals. And I think this is important. I think oftentimes a kind of issue or theme or sector is a kind of entry point for advocates. So in addition to kind of providing a global score for a country and their progress towards gender equality, we're also looking then at individual goals. And I'll show an example of that in a moment. The index has 53 indicators, which are distributed across those 14 SDGs. The index covers 128 countries, which represents about 94% of the world's girls and women. And as I said, we'll be launching the index and the report in early June. Next slide, please. So what makes the index unique? I think one question we often face is, do we need another gender index or do we need another index? What makes this index special or unique? How does it contribute to our knowledge of the situation today? And I think there's, a number of unique points about the SDG Gender Index. One important one, I think, is that it draws its policy relevance from consultations, very extensive consultations with advocates, with gender advocates and for advocates. So we really made every effort to reach out at the country level with our national implementing partners, with our partners who have a footprint across the world, and as well through other surveys and public consultations that we've held with gender advocates. So we really tried to design it in a way that advocates see themselves and they see their issues and they see it as their tool. And we think that's extremely important then for the use of the index. It's comprehensive, so there's no other index which looks across all of the SDGs. And I think that's really important because we're including not only traditional areas of gender analysis like health and education and work, but also areas which are neglected. And we saw a little bit of that in SIGI with SIGI with Data2X in terms of the data availability around gender and the environment. So we're trying to cover issues like energy, environment, public finance, and kind of areas which are very instrumental for gender equality, but often don't get the attention that they need. And part of the issue is around data availability. The index draws on a number of data sources. So first of all, it uses official SIGI indicators that are reported by countries. But not only that, and I think it's really important to note, and I think Nina kind of alluded to it, that there are a lot of difficulties in monitoring the SDGs, especially for gender equality, because a lot of the data is not available, or there isn't enough data covering enough countries. So the question then becomes, then how are we going to tell if we're making progress or not? And I think it's important then to maybe draw on other data sources that we can use in the interim as the data collection gets better and as data sources become available over time that we can draw on. And these include things like laws and policies and the norms and perceptions that Gail referred to, which are extremely important, and where we do have some indications and some indicators now to kind of complement the information that we want about outcomes. And I think at the same time, while we want to have this index used as a tool for advocacy and for monitoring the SDGs, we also want to say that it's not sufficient. We're using the best available data that we have now, and that's not always what we want to see. We know that there's better indicators. We know that there's better data. Some countries are already collecting it, but most are not. But we want to recognize that, and we want to also then lend our voice to advocacy for better data and for better measurement. And then I think just an important part of the index is that it's possible to really unpack it quickly. And I'll show an example. That's all right. You can go to the next slide. That it's possible to kind of unpack and communicate the results quickly. Indexes can take different approaches. Some can be very detailed and generate a lot of kind of intermediate figures around different issues. But we tried to make the SDG Gender Index something which is very transparent, something which is very parsimonious, that means simple and easy to use. And this is an example from our pilot. And for the launch of the index in June, we'll have this for 128 countries, and we'll have it for 2 additional SDGs, so SDG 9 and 11 on infrastructure and cities. But I think just starting with this heat map approach, I think it's really helpful and intuitive as a way of kind of identifying issues across the SDGs. So we can see, for example, that Colombia performed fairly well on the index, and we see in poverty reduction, nutrition, health, education, that there's good scores in water and energy as well. But we also see that there's weaknesses. And I think that's one strength or one way that the index results can be used is to identify those hotspots, to identify those weaknesses in gender equality. And again, oftentimes they might come in areas which are less traditional, which are less part of traditional gender analysis. And here we can see that in terms of Colombia and SDG 16, which is around the justice system and around violence against women issues. And we can also see that even the best performing country, in this case Colombia, had still some places where it can improve. And then we can also see where other countries face challenges. And we can see Kenya having challenges where you see the red color is a lower score, the green color is a higher score. Where you can see the red in Kenya is around water, goal 6, and energy, goal 7, as well as 17, public finance, 3, health, 4, education. So there's a number of areas that one could look at. And I think that's one way that you can use the index is to identify some of those hotspots, but it's also then something that can be used to compare countries. And in the case, I don't know if Alison will mention it, but in the case of some of our national implementing partners, some of them use those comparisons in their advocacy. So now let's talk about unpacking it. So sorry, go back one slide. Yeah. So now I just want to look at how you can unpack the index very quickly. So for each of those goals, there's 3 to 5 indicators which represent the issue. So when I mentioned that Kenya was not performing well in terms of SDG 7 on energy. We can quickly unpack the indicators. So there's 3 indicators in Goal 7 around energy. Here we can see that Kenya, in relation to the other countries, has a large proportion of the population that's using unclean fuels and technology. And here we can say that it's maybe a gender blind indicator, but I think the rationale that we have is that that there's a disproportionate effect on girls and women around clean fuels and technology and cooking fuels in the household. Next slide. And then in the case of Colombia, which scores fairly well across the goals, but where there was an issue in Goal 16, when we unpack Goal 16, and here we're using some of the perceptions-based information, which again, I agree with Gail that that's a really useful way, and I think a newer way of looking at some of the issues around norms and attitudes. But this is the perception of women aged 15 years plus who reported feeling safe walking in their neighborhood at night. This is data that's collected by Gallup, so not by national governments. But there we can see the lack of security that women feel in Colombia relative to other countries in the index, and as a way of looking at then what's driving that issue in the gold score for the index. Next slide. And so just finally, just to say that, it's not only about the index. The index is a nice way to frame issues. It's a nice way to look at the big picture and really map out the full picture, including all of these areas which are so instrumental for gender equality. But it's not enough. And I think we've developed the Gender Advocates Data Hub, and you can see the address there. It's still using pilot data, but in June it will be updated for all countries. And there we'll host the gender index data where you'll be able to see all of the measures, the scores, the indicators, the data sources, issues with the data, but then also deep dives in terms of some of the other data that exists, so that where we can draw on other data sources that are only covering smaller geographic regions and bring out some of those issues. Country profiles. We have a number of stories, especially in our focus countries, around the voices of girls and women in relation to the issues that the index highlights, and a number of other resources, including data visualizations and work around data for advocacy and a kind of training package that we have for using data for advocacy.
Thank you so much, Albert. This is your moderator, Susan here.
Anyway, we can answer your questions. Please do share them with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. This is Susan, the moderator. Just doing a quick time check on how we're doing. We have about 5 minutes left in the call, and we have a number of questions that have come in. We hope to be able to go till 10:45, but still we have a number of questions. So, Allison, if I could ask you to provide a very top line look at the work of the National Implementing Partners. And I would also invite all of the participants on the call to attend the Equal Measures 2030 event that will be happening at the Women Deliver conference, that you'll be able to find on the conference app, where you'll be able to interact with the National Implementing Partners up close and personal. But over to you, Allison, to give a very top line summary.
Sorry, okay. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Albert.
So I guess Allison won't come in, but just to say that one of the things that we relied on a lot was the views of gender advocates. And this is a quote from one of our gender advocates, stories moved me, but data changed me, around the importance that they see in data and evidence and some of the priorities that they see as essential in terms of answering some of the questions. Okay, sorry, I'll turn over to Allison.
Okay, sorry, I think that's working now. I'll go really quickly, just fly through the last couple of slides. I thought it was scheduled for an hour and a half, so apologies. We want to make sure to get to, I can see lots of good questions in the chat there. We can skip over this one. Albert's just mentioned about the advocate survey, and do visit our data hub. 2 points to make on our national partners. One is the index we see as only a starting point. So the idea is that our partners and advocates like yourselves would use the index as a segue or an entry point into the issues they're working on. And this is just an example of how our partner in India used the index pilot launch to also link it with data about violence against women in India that comes from more national India-specific studies, and they linked the 2 together for some really powerful media work. And next slide. I won't go into this in detail, but this was an example, and hopefully if you get the slides distributed after, there's the content here. It's just to talk, our partner in Kenya has had a really comprehensive approach to using data in their influencing. And as a result of that, over a very short project, they have been able to make some really important impact. They have been invited to join a statistical committee about gender data. And they have also had women from their grassroots network invited to join several policy committees, such as on the environment, on climate change, and other issues. And they have also secured some budget commitments amongst several county governments by using data in their advocacy. So we can share these and you can see, and we're happy to discuss with anyone after, but the point is the way that we're seeing advocates feeling like their advocacy is strengthened, their confidence is increased, and their voice is amplified when they really bring data alongside stories. I won't go over this one because we are ready to finish up. Last thing to say is just for Equal Measures, if you visit our website, equalmeasures2030.org, you can sign up for our newsletter, and that's a great way to find out every month or so what's going on with data and our partners.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison and Albert, for the overview on Equal Measures 2030. We're all eagerly awaiting the launch of the index at the conference, and we all are hoping to be able to engage with you and the national implementing partners more in Vancouver. Now I want to open it up for some questions and answers, and thank you to everyone who's taken the time to put in questions into the chat box. I'll just say 3 questions at a time and be directive in who I hope could answer them from the different presenters, and we'll see how quickly we can get through the questions. And if we're not able to get through all of the questions, because there are many, we will, we're taking note of all of these questions and we'll be following up with responses over email. The first question is a really simple question. Is the teleconference and are the slides being available to the participants moving forward on offline? Yes, we will be circulating recording of today's webinar alongside these slides, and you can use those with your colleagues at your leisure. The second question is, could you kindly clarify the difference between gender disaggregated data and sex disaggregated data? And I would like to direct that question to Nina, because Nina, I know the U2X has been very clear in defining what you mean by that, and I know that it differs slightly from the World Bank definition. The other question that we have that we'd like to direct to Data 2X is if you could highlight what's the rationale or what's the cause of why data collection frequency differs, why it's not regular, but why it's so important to be able to inform what's happening. So those are 2 questions that I'd like to direct to Nina. A question that I'd like to direct to Gael. Can you share sample questions that you ask to collect the kind of data that you're doing for gender index scores? And then a question that we have, Equal Measure 2030, is Why only 120 countries in Equal Measures 2030 Index? And then a question for all would be, how do you address data gaps in emergency settings and with refugees? So those will be the first tranche of questions we go through. But Anina, if you could address those questions directly pointed to Kate.
Sure, that's great. Thanks so much, Susan. And again, happy to continue conversation after the webinar as well with anybody who wants further clarification. So just in brief, the question about gender disaggregated data versus sex disaggregated data. A big topic of conversation we've had within Data 2X is coming up with a definition of gender data that we can comfortably get behind. And after a lot of discussion, we've sort of landed on going with the definition that the UN Statistics Division came up with, which is the same definition that UN Women and others use as well. So the main point here is that gender data, so not gender disaggregated data, but just gender data writ large, has many components. One component of gender data is sex disaggregated data. So this is data that has been disaggregated. It's been broken down by sex, by male versus female, where sex is a sort of biological determinant and something that many countries, when they're collecting their survey data, in censuses, et cetera, people are forced to identify as either male versus female. And this then leads to data that can be disaggregated by male versus female. But gender data is broader than just sex disaggregated data. Gender data also includes data about the experiences of women, et cetera, going beyond just straight up splitting the data down between men versus women. When we talk about gender disaggregated data, you're talking about data that's being broken down, that's being disaggregated by gender, where gender is not a biological determinant, but maybe more of a sociological definition or a way people choose to identify. Now, some countries are moving in this direction and are taking really great strides, and I believe that we will get there. We will get to a point where it'll be possible to disaggregate data by gender, not just by sex, but it's pointing to the need for people to be able to self-identify and for the ability for people to be able to identify not just as male versus female, but other forms of gender presentation. So I hope that helps explain the difference between gender disaggregated data and sex disaggregated data. On the question for availability, the reason why some data has been collected more frequently, or some countries are choosing to collect data on a larger number of indicators, but doing it less frequently, it's a matter of capacity, and it's also a matter of how countries are going about their data collection. Through the research that we did with Bridging the Gap, we found that there was a really high dependence on internationally sponsored surveys. So this includes surveys like the NICS or the DHS that you probably have heard of. And in addition, many countries also conduct some sort of living standard survey to collect data as well. There's less reliance on administrative data, so that's more data like civil registration and vital statistics, and it has to do with capacities in country and resourcing. So a recommendation that we had coming out of this work is that there really needs to be a strengthening of capacity, both in terms of resourcing and in terms of just the number of people available and trained to be able to collect data, to use a broader cross section of data collection types, because you get different amounts of data with different levels of specificity and on different areas of people's lives when you have stronger survey data versus administrative data, et cetera. So it comes down to capacity and resourcing for the most part. I'll pause there and let someone else answer other questions.
So I think the next question was directed to Gael about the question of sample questions that you use to be able to develop the index and whether or not you'd be able to share those.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. And it's actually the opportunity for me to say that everything we are doing is a public good. So if you go to our website, genderindex.org, you will find the questionnaires, for example. So let me answer in two ways. First of all, giving you a concrete example on how we collect data on laws first, and that's part of the SDG 5.1.1 indicator. So this is a clear questionnaire addressed, first of all, to the government and legal experts. So two different people from the same country are filling in this questionnaire. And this is a very simple questionnaire, but with, I will say, different levels of questions. So first of all, for child marriage, the question would be, what is the minimum legal age of marriage for a girl? Then the same question for a boy. Then is there any exceptions? And we list the different exceptions that usually exist.
Great.
So at the end, it's a yes or no answer, and we work on it. Of course, we ask for full references for us to check each laws. Then you have what I will call the attitudinal data. And here again, please go to our website. You have the questionnaire in English for Uganda, in French for Burkina Faso. Well, you have to take into account that the same question could not always be asked in the same way according to the country, especially because we will also have to translate the question into specific dialect. Okay, if you're going to the Sahel in North Burkina Faso, people are not always used to speak in French. So it's very important to keep that in mind. So here again, we will have different kind of questions. We will have what I would call direct question, is that, is there, in your opinion, is a man justifiable in beating his wife in certain circumstances? And there you have the lists of circumstances, because it's very important to detail the things and also to define what is beating. So here again, you can have a look. I think it will help you. And then you have another kind of question that is more indirect, is that according to you, does a man beating his wife a good man? And the response could be, the answer could be, I fully agree, I agree, I'm neutral, I disagree, and I fully disagree. So again, I think the easiest way for you would be to look at the questionnaire. And as this is individual questionnaire, you can have also intersectional issues. So meaning that you can see whether people living in rural areas, according to their level of education, income, ethnicity, religious, disability, etc., have or not, first of all, experience the same issues, and second, have the same attitudes toward harmful practices against women and men, because I was focusing on discrimination against women, but we are also trying to understand better masculinities.
Great. Thank you, Gael, for the elaboration on the question and for letting the participants know the questionnaires are accessible online. There were a few questions for Equal Measures 2030 around the index, about the 128 countries. There also is a question about whether the index is going to be presented by region. And then we have, I think we'll need to take a final question that would be a cross-cutting question around how do we address the needs of girls and women in emergency settings and also refugee communities.
Okay, great. Susan, I can take the question for Equal Measures. So it's a good question. Why are there 128 countries? Why not more? And it's a question that we get very often. The thing is, once you start becoming familiar with the data, and we should be clear that the index that Equal Measures makes is made up of data that already exists publicly for the most part in the world. So it's either data that countries report to the UN, or data that countries report through other mechanisms, or that the World Bank plays a role in compiling or collecting in some cases. We have other data that is collected by polling companies like Gallup, but in all cases, it's data that exists in some format already. And we're compiling that into our index. And once you get involved in that, you become very quickly aware of how many data gaps there are. And that is the main and only reason why there's not more countries in the index. And in fact, even to get to 128 countries, Albert and our team who lead on the data work had to work very, very hard. We wanted to include countries in the index where the data was comparable, and we didn't want to include countries that were missing more than 15% of the data points. So once you bring in, trying to keep it robust, it's very limited. And that's brings us back to the points that Data 2X were making around also needing to advocate for more investment to fill those data gaps so that over time, more countries can be included. And then was there a question regionally in the report that will come out and the data hub that will be presented in at the Women Deliver conference in Vancouver? It will very much be organized regionally, so you'll be able to compare your country to others in the region, and you'll be able to see also how their score compares globally as well. And then the final question on specific challenges for girls and women in emergencies, I think a few things. One is that I think the SDGs, when they were created, there was a lot of discussion about whether there should be certain goals and targets pertaining to fragile states and conflict-affected countries. And I think the idea was that all of the issues apply equally in those countries. So that means that in some ways it's a bit of a gap in that there's not a whole goal around reducing conflict or reaching girls and women in emergencies. We've just been working on a small project related to that, and I can tell you from that the data gaps that we're talking about on this webinar are even more profound for countries in emergency contexts. And so it is even more difficult. So I think what we can do is to look at the index for countries that are included in our index who have had some recent history of fragility. We can look, are there trends, are they performing worse on the index than other countries? We can do some of that, but by and large, the point that girls and women in fragile contexts are left out of the data picture is definitely true from my experience.
Thank you so much, Allison. We also have a number of really incredible questions around age disaggregated data and whether these indices disaggregate by age. There's also a very important question about non-binary gender divisions. There are several questions about that. I'm looking at my time and we have about a minute left. So I do think that these are two very important questions. So if panelists could potentially quickly share their points of view on whether or not these indices look at age differences, particularly adolescents and older women, and then what is your response to the question about non-binary gender divisions, and how does gender data currently take that into account? And if it doesn't, how could advise advocates for places to look for that really critical data, and what can the advocacy community do to make sure that we aren't having a data gap there?
Susan, this is Nina. I can go first. I won't weigh in on the age disaggregated aspect of the indices. I'll let the people who spoke about indices talk about that. Really quickly, just going back to the data on women in emergency situations, just to say that UNHCR does do some data collection, and Data 2X was working with the joint IDP profiling service with some work around there. It's a really tough area, obviously, to collect data just overall when populations are moving, and sex disaggregated data, gender data becomes even more challenging to collect. So just basically acknowledging that, yes, there's a real gap in this area as well. And obviously it's really critical to understand how many women we have in these types of situations, because then humanitarian response can be targeted accordingly to needs, but it's not an area that's been cracked yet. Like I said, I'll leave the age disaggregated data, and then going to the question about the gender non-binary issue. That's exactly what I was sort of referring to when I was talking about the difference between sex disaggregated data and gender disaggregated data. There's several countries that are working towards this, Canada being one of them, and the host of the Women Deliver conference, that are either changing questions in their censuses to allow people to identify in different ways. But I would say this is very much at the cutting edge of where we are with data collection and the ability to disaggregate. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Any of the panelists, Gael or Allison, would you like to weigh in briefly on the indices, both the SIGI index, but the SDG gender index that Equal Measures 2030 is doing, and whether or not you're able to look at it by age?
Yeah, so again, it depends on which SIGI tool you're talking about. So first of all, at the international level, the SIGI conceptual framework is actually taking a life cycle approach. So meaning that, for example, for girls, child girl, we will look at missing women. For adolescent girl, we are looking at child marriage. For the elderly, we are looking at widows, inheritance rights. So it really depends. So we really try to not disaggregate the data by age, but to really address all these issues women can face through their life cycle. And then the second point is that with the country study, the SIGI country studies, here again, this is individual surveys, So everything could be disaggregated by age and other characteristics, demographics, socio-demographic characteristics.
Yes, that in the case of the SDG gender index for equal measures, it really depends on the goal that one's looking at. So it's a limited set of indicators, and again, as a framing device. So looking at the 53 indicators. For some goals, it's more difficult to have a life cycle approach. Some of the issues affect both girls and women. For example, in the case of water or in energy or environment. But then there are also other goals where we use a life cycle approach as well. So for example, for SDG 4 on education, we follow the trajectory of a girl to a young woman through the education system and to the labor market. So there are some cases where if you're interested in looking at specific population groups, that it's possible, but that in other cases it's more general, more affecting the general population.
Great. Thank you, Albert, for coming in on that question as well. So unfortunately, we are up against the clock. There are a really terrific number of questions, and I'm also want to commend and applaud all of the participants who are hanging in with us for this webinar. I think the degree of questions, the number of questions, and the fact that so many of the participants stayed on really is an indication of how critical this topic of gender data is, and how important it is for policies and decision making to be inclusive, and for how critical it is for accountability purposes to make sure that these SDG policies and the domestic policies that are being designed are being delivered with the intended results. So we hope that today you were able to start to get a flavor for this very, very rich subject area. And we invite all of you to continue this conversation with us at the Women Deliver Conference in Vancouver in June. If you're not able to join us, we will be having sessions via WD Live and our virtual conference mobilization to be able to talk about this issue in greater detail. We also hope that you will leave the webinar today aware of new tools and emerging tools to be able to integrate gender data into your work and policy analysis and advocacy. And thirdly, we hope that you've been able to learn how to begin to advance the use of gender data and to call for the closure of those data gaps. I think that the question for non-binary gender communities is such a critical and important question for us as a community to wrestle with. And we would invite you all to take the survey. Again, this is really important for us to be able to know what you were able to glean from the webinar, what you hope we can cover in future webinars so that we can continue this very important discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded and we will be sharing notes. We will be sharing the slides, and we will be sharing all of the questions with responses that we will socialize with all of the panelists. So for those of you who weren't able to have your questions answered, please know that we will be coming back to you with responses. Thank you again for your participation today, and thank you especially to our speakers for joining us today. Have a wonderful morning or afternoon wherever you may be in the world. Thanks a lot.